Everybody, good evening and welcome to the Grand Boulevard Coalition show. My name is Cynthia Alvarez and I am your host for today. And as you all know, I am also a case manager for Healthy Living, our number one goal. And I just wanted to announce that this will be my last CAN TV for today and for the foreseeable future. Unless things happen, we'll see. Hopefully I'm able to return. But this will be the last one that I'm doing for now. And yeah, so I just wanted to let people know, let people be aware, and then give some thanks to some people at the end of the show for today. But before we get into all of that, I do want to discuss the topic for today, and that is going to be on setting boundaries and the importance of boundary setting with mental health. So, kind of talking about why boundary setting is important, how people can take the steps to do it, the benefits of it, and yeah, what to do in situations if people happen to maybe cross those boundaries and how you can go forward from there. But yeah, before we get into that, I do want to recap our last youth talk that we did a couple Saturdays ago and just kind of go over how that went with some of the youth. We were able to do some practices related to setting goals and goal settings. So learning about a specific activity that can help people and help youth specifically. But this was also for anybody who's learning how to set their own goals, right? So goal setting practices such as SMART. That was one of the focuses we had, using SMART to set specific goals, make sure our goals are specific, are measurable, and making sure that they are meaningful to our long-term goals, whether that be professional, personal, or career goals. So yeah, we do have information on that available on our Padlet if you are interested. That can be found through our social medias, as you all know, Healthy Living CAP on Facebook and Instagram, and CAP Healthy Living on Instagram or Facebook. So you just search those up and you'll be able to find our page and find the Padlet information through there. So yeah, that is what we went through and what we talked about for that youth talk. So now getting into the topic for today, boundaries, right? So I'm sure we've all heard the word boundaries. Boundaries mean saying no, or, just hearing the word boundaries. Some people have heard just the basics of it, but we're going to go a lot more into depth today. And so boundaries, thinking about that word specifically, they're meant to kind of protect our overall mental well-being, and that includes emotional, spiritual, mental, physical, and all of that kind of together, right? So it includes a lot more things, but it's just about our overall well-being as a human being, and just kind of thinking about what are things that help keep us safe, happy, healthy, and functioning adults or youth as well, right? So boundary setting is for anybody, and that is something that is useful for anybody at any age, especially when you're younger. Or if you're a parent with a child, you want to teach them about boundaries when they're really young, right? Because that's when it's really going to stick with them the most. But it's never too late to learn about boundaries, especially if you were never taught or you never heard the word. There's always somewhere to begin. So we can always start small with small boundaries, and we're kind of going to get into some examples of that as well. So they help us build trust and safety with any relationship that we may have, right? So not just partners, but it can also be friendships. It can be your relationships with your family. It can be your relationship with your coworkers, your boss, even the relationship you have with work as a whole, even boundaries with yourself, right? Because we can also set boundaries with ourselves, right? And just things that we believe are going to help us improve overall skills, overall mental health, and things like that. So why are boundaries important and linked to our mental health, right? Like, how do those things go together? So like I mentioned, setting those boundaries can protect your mental well-being, and it can help you from developing bad habits, right? So if you're starting, if you're in a relationship, for example, and maybe there are some things that your partner does that you don't like and that maybe affect your mental health, or make you feel uncomfortable, make you feel unsafe. These things can have an impact on your mental health. It can start to cause maybe anxiety, depression. Not that these are the causes of this, but when it comes to more drastic things, such as maybe financial abuse or abuse, physical abuse, mental, emotional abuse, you know, those are things that you can try in the beginning of your relationships to set boundaries for. Obviously, if the person that is doing these behaviors that are affecting you negatively are hurting you, harming you, that's when you need to take a bigger look outside of just boundaries, right? Because you can try to set a boundary with somebody, but if they're not listening or respecting those boundaries, that's when you have to realize, okay, this situation isn't safe for me. I've tried establishing boundaries, but it's not working. That's when you know that this isn't an issue that you can solve with boundaries, and when you need to kind of separate yourself from a specific situation, right? So those are just some examples of how it can get to more severe cases. But obviously, boundaries can be for any case, right? So it can be for something really small, even something as much as reminding yourself to eat breakfast in the morning, right? Or making time to study, or, boundaries like that for yourself, right? Or setting alarms for yourself to have a good sleep schedule, right? So, kind of setting boundaries for yourself, and things like that. So, you can start small, and that's kind of the best way to go for people who are just learning about setting boundaries, right? And yeah, so they can also prevent burnouts. Burnout is something that is very real, especially it can happen within friendships, relationships, but especially when we're thinking about workspaces and work in general. If you don't set boundaries with your job, this is something that can affect you mentally. If you have maybe a relationship with coworkers or even with your boss that might be unhealthy, maybe they're reaching out to you when they shouldn't be after hours, right? When you're no longer at work and they want you to continue working on something, or maybe they expect you to stay longer to finish a project. And setting boundaries in the workspace can help you and help prevent burnout, right? And it can help prevent it sooner. And it's not to say that burnout will happen or will not happen because you have boundaries, but it kind of helps you set boundaries for yourself that can say, okay, I'm going to make sure I prevent burnout, and I want to maybe ignore work calls after 5 p.m., right? You get off work at 5 p.m., and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to ignore work calls after 5. And I'm not going to pay attention to any emails relating to work after I get out. And those kind of things can help with burnout, right? Even taking the time to say, I'm going to do self-care for myself maybe once a week or twice a week. So this kind of also goes with goal setting, right? Making sure you set boundaries are kind of like making goals for yourself, for other people. But yeah, so that's kind of how it can go into mental health. It can also improve your self esteem and self worth and confidence. So when you're able to be firm with your boundaries with other people and yourself, you're able to feel more confident in yourself in general. And that can kind of improve the way you view yourself, being proud of yourself for setting boundaries and saying, oh, I established this boundary with this person, and maybe I'm having trouble with setting boundaries with this other person, but I have the confidence from this other boundary I set that I think I can do it with this next person, right? And boundaries are things that, for some people, it might not be as important, but that shouldn't scare you away from setting boundaries for yourself. So if there are people who may not respect your boundaries, it's important to address that, address why they aren't respecting your boundaries, letting them know how it makes you feel, and things like that, right? Because those kinds of things can also kind of mix in with mental health if you have people who are constantly, crossing those boundaries, right? And making you feel unsafe, whether that's intentional or unintentional. Those are things that need to be addressed along the way. And so an example, asking your boss asking you to stay late, right? That's something that can lead to a quicker burnout, right? If you start a job and maybe you can already kind of sense some of the patterns that this job has, and you notice, oh, a lot of these people are staying later than they're supposed to, and it kind of puts that pressure on you. You might feel like you have to stay later, and just kind of seeing the environment you're in. It's all about setting boundaries with the environment, right? So if you see that maybe your coworkers, maybe they're making jokes that might be inappropriate, about you or other people, you can try to protect your own mental peace and say, okay, I'm not going to engage with them in conversations. And if you feel the confidence to confront your coworkers and you feel like you have the safe space to do so, maybe you have a supportive boss who will, understand why you're staying up to your coworkers about making these inappropriate jokes. You can kind of help set that boundary and say, hey, I don't appreciate these jokes. They make me and others uncomfortable. And they have to respect that, right? If they don't, then that's when the issue comes with, okay, now I'm going to speak with my boss, right? Because I tried setting that boundary, but it wasn't respected. So kind of learning about, things like that, because obviously in a perfect world, people will respect your boundaries as soon as you set them. But sometimes you have to be assertive and you have to be consistent with, making sure, hey, remember I set that boundary that, I don't want you touching my things without asking me for permission, right? So let's say maybe this could even be like a sibling or a friend that constantly borrows or takes things without asking. And you've let them, take your things without asking for a long time, so they've gotten used to it. And now you say, okay, you know what? Actually, I don't like this, and I don't appreciate this. I feel like my things are not being respected. I feel like I'm not being respected. So I'm going to tell my friend or my sibling, like, hey, I don't appreciate you taking my things. I would appreciate maybe if you asked me first and see if you could borrow my stuff before you take it, and kind of go from there, right? So it's all about having a good back and forth and good communication, because if you're trying to set a boundary and you say, okay, I need you to do this, they might not take it the right way. And then it becomes a problem, maybe a bigger issue, right, than what you wanted when your intentions were only to set a boundary. It definitely has there's a lot of power in the way you come across to somebody, right? So as long as you're being respectful but assertive at the same time, because you can be assertive without being rude, right? So you can say, hey, like, I really don't like this, right? And it hurts my feelings, right? And yeah, so kind of thinking about that are some little tips to think about when you're trying to set boundaries. And when you're learning and starting to set boundaries, for some people it might be hard to think about, how a lot of people say boundaries are, oh, you're saying no to things or you're saying no to people. It's not necessarily saying no to people or saying no to things. It's the way you say it, and, making sure that you say with intent why you don't want these things happening, why you're setting this boundary, and letting them know why it's important to you, right? So if they understand, if there's someone that cares about you, they will understand why you're setting this boundary and why it's important to you, right? And when it comes to, how we talked about earlier, if they don't understand why it's important to you, maybe it becomes a bigger issue as to maybe, do I want to continue having this person in my life? Do they add more stress to my life? Are the boundaries not working? Why are they not working? And making sure you have that conversation with them if they're able to and willing to have that conversation with you as well. So you can learn to rephrase that quote unquote no, right? Instead of saying no, you're saying, with work, for example, right? Letting them know, hey, I'm letting you know I will not be answering any phone calls after 5 p.m. just because I want to take the time to relax and unwind after work, or I have other, things I need to attend to after work where I can't really focus on this, but I'm happy to focus on it when I'm back in the office tomorrow or during my work hours, right? So letting them know, even if you set that boundary with yourself, some of these boundaries you have to set with other people and let them know, hey, I don't like when you call me at, at 7 o'clock after work. I'm busy doing other things. But I'm willing to work on it when I come back in, right? So learning to rephrase the word no and say, okay, this is what I'm not going to do. This is my boundary. And this is why I'm setting it, right? And sometimes you don't even need a reason. Sometimes you don't even need to justify yourself. And you can just say, hey, I don't like this. I don't like I don't like being touched. I don't like being hugged. And those are some boundaries that people have and they just don't like it. It makes them uncomfortable. And maybe for some people who are huggers, that show affection to friends or family, they might feel a little offended by that. But then that's when, if you're the person on the other end receiving a boundary from a friend saying, hey, I don't like hugging, it makes me uncomfortable, and that's it. You don't have to, you as the friend receiving the boundary shouldn't question them. You shouldn't make them feel guilty. You should give them the space and kind of like a safe space, right? To make them feel like, okay, I can share this with you, right? Because you're my friend and I care about you. And if I'm making you uncomfortable, I want to know, right? And those are things that, people who do care about you, who are people in your life that you want to keep in your life, you will respect what they have to say, right? So it is a lot about respect and understanding and having that back and forth, right? So making sure you try not to take things personally if they try to set a boundary that might offend you. If you do want a deeper understanding, that's where you can have that conversation and say, oh, I'm a hugger and I love to show affection. Why don't you like it? That's just me showing you that I love you and that I care about you. But maybe you can come to a compromise on another way to show affection, right? And maybe we can decide on doing like a fist bump or like a elbow bump, like something that might compromise and make you feel more comfortable, right? So that's all about making sure you have that good back and forth with somebody. So yeah, those are some examples. There's a lot of, different examples that we can talk about with setting boundaries, but make sure, like I mentioned, you're setting your boundaries in an assertive and respectful way, right? So making sure you let them know, this is how I feel, and I don't appreciate these things, but I love you and I care about you, and I want to maintain a happy and healthy relationship with you. So this is just what I feel like I need to make me feel more comfortable. And it's it's not to hurt your feelings. This is just how I feel, right? So having those, using these kind of tips can kind of help you have these conversations with people. Because it can be hard to set boundaries. You can feel a little sense of guilt maybe with setting boundaries, and that might make you feel like you're doing something wrong, especially if the other person is taking the boundary setting in a negative way. They might make you feel guilty about it, like, oh, I can't believe this offends you, or I can't believe, that you're telling me this, So people who might not like you setting boundaries with them, you have to be assertive with them and you have to let them know. And, that kind of thing, making sure that you don't take things to offense if you're that person. So, just making sure that they understand why. And if they don't, like I said, that's when it becomes a bigger issue, right? And even when it comes to setting boundaries with ending relationships, right? Maybe if you're breaking up with somebody and it's hard to stop talking to them, it's hard to stop contacting them, something that you can try to set a boundary for yourself is, an example that I saw was, oh, when I'm having a bad day, I'm not going to reach out to this person anymore because you and a partner, you broke up and now you're trying to distance yourself from them so that you can heal fully from that relationship, right? And if you're constantly going back to a relationship, it could even be like a friendship, right? You want to make sure that you set this boundary for yourself and say, okay, when I'm having a bad day, I'm not going to reach out to them. That's just going to keep that connection going, and what you want to do and what is best for you mentally is to end that relationship, right? So kind of getting out of these bad habits are some of the positives of setting these boundaries. Once you actually fully commit and are super consistent with the boundary setting, that's something that can overall improve your life, right? So what should you do if someone crosses your boundary, right? We kind of talked a little bit about this. So that's kind of, like I said, you have to be consistent, let them know it matters, this boundary matters, and you're serious about it. Because if you let someone break that boundary and you say it to them once and then they kind of, maybe they'll say, oh, I forgot, or they might not care, right? Some people, that might not care or take your boundaries seriously will still keep doing it, right? So if you let them continue to do it, it's almost like you never set that boundary in the first place. So even though you took that first step of saying, okay, this is my boundary, if they're not respecting it, now you have to stay consistent with it. And even though that might be hard sometimes, you have to remind them, like, hey, remember we talked about this and how this makes me feel. you know, this is upsetting to me that you forgot. I hope you don't forget again in the future. And yeah, so kind of starting the conversation like that, right? And you are allowed to readjust your boundaries too, right? So if maybe there's a boundary that you have that you're like, oh, I want to change this, maybe instead of, for people who need mental health breaks, right? Maybe they prefer to have alone time and don't want to, maybe they ignore messages from people and say, oh, instead of, taking my mental health day once a week, I actually need 2 days out of the week to recuperate mentally from the tough week that I'm having, right? So you can have a week where you say, hey, I know we said we were going to do this today, but I think I need a mental health day today. So I don't really feel comfortable going out right now, but we can reschedule and figure out things from there, right? So you are allowed to readjust your boundaries because we change and we grow as people. So things that, we used to do before, maybe we're changing that up a little bit and we need to readjust that. And that's perfectly fine and that's perfectly normal, right? And yeah, so those are some examples. And if you ever feel, like we said, if you ever feel guilt for establishing these boundaries, it's totally normal. It is a process that you really have to stick with and you have to make sure that you are more consistent with yourself, right? Because even though some of these boundaries do connect with relationships with other people, you cannot fully expect the other person to then take charge of this because this was your boundary that you set. So it is in a way your responsibility to set this boundary and to maintain that boundary, right? Unless you decide to change it. And then that's when you have to have that conversation with them again, right? And so I can give a personal example too. Like when I was in school, I was really, really stressed and going through a lot of things mentally with school. It was just very draining. And I had a friend who was going through a really, really hard time and wanted to talk on the phone every day. And talking on the phone for me is something that drains me a little bit. And so having to do it constantly was something that was kind of stressful. It became stressful for me, even though I did want to be there for my friend. I also had other things going on in my life on top of me having, the anxiety or maybe, with the phones and having phone calls is not something that I do every single day or that I like to do every single day. So it did get to a point where I waited and then I decided to say, hey, I don't like talking on the phone every day. I love you and I want to be there for you. I care about you a lot and I want to make sure you're doing okay. But I am going through a lot with school right now and I'm really stressed about my own things going on and I don't want to add that to your plate. So I just want to make sure that you know that I care about you, but we need to maybe cut down on the phone calls, maybe do 2 times a week phone calls, or, just make sure you text me first and ask if I'm mentally in a good place to talk on the phone. So kind of having conversations like that, right? It can be a little hard, but the longer you wait, the more it will hurt you. So that is something that sometimes we need to learn those lessons, right? Like, okay, we need to get hurt a little bit first to see, okay, I realize I don't like this, so I'm going to set that boundary. So yeah, those are a few of the tips, some advice. that you can take with you when it comes to setting boundaries. I hope you all were able to learn a little bit of that today. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my team from Healthy Living, our number one goal. Lakita, Maggie, Laurel. This was the team that we had for Healthy Living, and it was a great team that we had. I'm very thankful for all the work that we've done together and all the ways that we've grown together. I'm very appreciative of everything that we've done and very appreciative of my team as well. I wish them nothing but the best. And I just want to say thank you to you all for joining me on Thursdays when I'm here and listening to the shows. I hope you learned a little bit today about boundaries, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday. Have a good night. Thank you.